I remember the summer of the year 1485 not as a season of warmth, but as a season of whispers. The air itself seemed heavy, not with the heat of the August sun, but with the weight of secrets. I had served in the court of King Richard III for 3 years, and during that time I had come to know the man behind the crown. Sharp of mind, unyielding in ambition, and suspicious of all who smiled too warmly. Yet, in those last days before his death, there was something different about him. His eyes, once keen and restless, now searched the shadows as though they held the answer to some unspoken dread. Rumors moved through the corridors of Nottingham Castle like a silent plague. They said that Henry Tudor, a pretender long exiled, had crossed the sea with an army of foreign soldiers, French mercenaries and desperate Welshmen alike, and that he marched toward us even now. But it was not the enemy's army that frightened me. No, the true danger lay within. There were lords who had feasted at Richard's table, sworn oaths of loyalty before God himself, and yet in secret had exchanged letters with Tudor's men. Treachery, like a rot in the timber, was spreading unseen. I had been tasked, as one of the lesser clerks in the royal service, with handling intercepted letters and reports from our scouts. Each day I opened wax seals that were never meant to be broken by my hands. Some were full of meaningless bravado, but others chilled me to my core. One, taken from a captured courier near Leicester, spoke of a promise. When the battle begins, the hawk shall turn its talons inward. I did not know the full meaning, but I suspected it was a pledge of betrayal from a noble of high rank. I carried it to my superior, only to be told with a thin smile that the king was already aware. Some truths, he said, are better left to unfold in their own time. Richard was not idle in the face of this gathering storm. He sent word for his banners to be raised and for his loyal lords to muster their forces. Men came in from the shires, their armor dull from long storage, their faces pale from the thought of marching against their own countrymen. The king addressed them in the courtyard, his voice cutting through the air like a drawn blade. He spoke of loyalty, of the sanctity of the crown, and of the curse that would fall upon oath-breakers. Yet I saw in the crowd the faces of men who would not stand firm when the hour came. At night, the castle was restless. The watchmen walked the walls, their lanterns swinging, while inside, the great hall was alive with the murmur of urgent counsels. The king slept little, and when he did, he would sometimes startle awake, demanding his sword. I wondered if he dreamt of Bosworth. Though the battle had not yet been fought, the name was already whispered in the halls, as if fate had chosen it. It was during one of these nights that I made a discovery which has haunted me to this day. I had been sent to deliver a bundle of orders to Lord Stanley, a man whose loyalty was the subject of much speculation. He had answered the king's summons but kept his forces camped at a distance, claiming illness. As I entered his chambers, I found him not in bed but seated at a table, speaking in low tones to a hooded figure. They fell silent at my appearance. The hooded man rose, moving quickly past me, and I caught a glimpse of a ring upon his hand, a ring bearing the emblem of Henry Tudor. Lord Stanley offered me a cold smile and took the orders from my hands. "We shall meet at the field soon enough," he said, though whether the promise was meant for me or for the man who had just left, I could not say. I left with my heart pounding. That moment, I believe, was the first time I truly understood that the coming battle might be decided not by swords, but by the weight of unseen bargains. The days that followed passed in a strange half-light of dread and determination. The king's army marched south, the banners of the White Boar flying high. I rode among the supply wagons, watching as men sharpened their blades or muttered prayers under their breath. Yet I also saw glances exchanged between certain captains, glances that spoke of shared secrets. The hawk from the intercepted letter could have been any one of them. On the eve of the march into Leicestershire, Richard gathered his closest commanders in his tent. I was stationed outside, taking notes as messages were brought in and out. Through the canvas walls I could hear fragments of his voice. Stanley's loyalty, watch Norfolk's flank, strike at Tudor before his reinforcements. It was the voice of a man determined to fight to the last. But I also heard another voice, low and insistent, urging him to hold back, to wait for more certainty. I could not place it, but I recognized the tone. It was the tone of a man who counsels delay not for safety, but for the advantage of the enemy. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something grim. The king was walking into a battle where the line between friend and foe was blurred beyond recognition. Victory would require not only defeating Tudor's army, but also surviving the treachery festering among his own. When dawn came, the march resumed. The fields stretched wide under the pale sky, and the sound of thousands of boots and hooves beat like a great drum of fate. The men sang no songs. Every step forward brought us closer to Bosworth, though none yet dared speak the word aloud in the king's hearing. And I, poor fool that I was, still believed that a man as cunning and unyielding as Richard could outwit both enemy and traitor alike. I would learn soon enough how wrong I was. We moved like a great serpent through the countryside, our columns twisting across the rolling fields of Leicestershire. The sun rose pale each morning, as if reluctant to witness what was to come. The hoofbeats of the king's warhorse were a steady, almost reassuring rhythm, but I had learned by then that such sounds could not mask the truth. The air among the men was thick with suspicion. You could feel it when they looked at one another too long, when they spoke in clipped sentences that ended as soon as you drew near. Richard rode at the head of the host, clad in dark armor that caught the weak sunlight like oil on water. His white boar standard fluttered above him, a bold proclamation of his claim, but I wondered whether its brightness only drew the eyes of those who wished to strike him down. At his right rode the Duke of Norfolk, loyal still, or so the king believed. Behind them rode lords whose smiles had grown colder with each passing day. It was on the third day of the march that I overheard something that tightened the knot of dread in my chest. I had been sent ahead to arrange provisions in a small village where we were to halt. While securing a storehouse for the grain, I passed by the open window of an alehouse. Inside, two men in the livery of Lord Stanley sat at a rough table, speaking in low tones. "He waits for the sign," one said. "The hawk?" asked the other. "Aye, the hawk will not move until the prey is within reach." They fell silent when they noticed me. I pretended to be about my business, but the words lodged in my mind like thorns. The hawk, again that cursed name. I thought of the intercepted letter, of Stanley's meeting with the hooded man. Whatever role he played, it was clear now that it was not one of simple indecision. That evening, the king summoned Lord Stanley and his brother, Sir William, to his tent. I was not present for the meeting, but the tale spread quickly among the servants. It was said Richard demanded they bring their forces to join his main army at once, but Stanley claimed his illness still kept him from riding close. The king, in his fury, is rumored to have taken Stanley's son, Lord Strange, as a hostage to ensure his loyalty. I remember one soldier muttering, "If Stanley means to betray him, not even his own blood will stop it." Our march slowed as we drew nearer to the place where fate would decide all. The land here was damp and uneven, the fields broken by low ridges and tangled hedgerows. I saw the king's captains studying the terrain with wary eyes. A battle fought here would be treacherous, the ground itself favoring ambush and sudden flight. It was during this time that another shadow fell across my path. One night, as I carried messages between the king's camp and Norfolk's, a figure stepped from the darkness. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could see the glint of mail beneath his cloak. He pressed a folded scrap of parchment into my hand. "For your master," he said. His voice was low, and before I could ask who had sent him, he was gone. I delivered it to the king at once. He read it in silence, his expression hardening with each line. When he had finished, he burned the parchment in the candle flame. The only words he spoke were, "The serpent coils tighter." He would say no more, and I did not dare to ask. That night, I saw him sitting alone by the embers of the fire, his sword across his knees. He looked not like a king, but like a man who knows the ground beneath his feet is about to give way. There was a heaviness in the air that I can only describe as the stillness before a storm. By the time we reached the vicinity of Bosworth Field, there was no longer any doubt that Henry Tudor was near. Scouts reported his army encamped not far off, bolstered by French pikemen and loyal Welsh retainers. The king's own forces numbered more, but numbers alone could not be trusted when the loyalty of many was in question. The morning before the battle, I passed through the outer lines and saw Lord Stanley's camp. His banners stood apart, fluttering in the wind, but his men were idle, sharpening blades and mending armor. Not the work of an army held back by illness, but one waiting for the right moment to move. When I returned to the king with my report, he dismissed it with a wave of the hand, though his jaw was set. I could see it in him now, the awareness that he was encircled not only by enemies across the field, but by traitors at his back. Yet Richard was a man who thrived in defiance. His decision was made. He would not wait for betrayal to come creeping in the dark. He would strike at Tudor directly, end the pretender's claim, and scatter those who conspired against him before they could act. That night, as the campfires burned low, I heard the sound of a prayer carried on the wind. It was the king's voice, though whether he prayed to God for victory or for the strength to meet death, I could not tell. When dawn came, the mist lay thick over the fields. The army formed ranks in silence, the white boar banners lifting in the damp breeze. Richard mounted his war horse, armor gleaming, his gaze fixed toward the unseen enemy. The tension was unbearable. We all knew the next hours would decide not just the crown, but the fate of every man here. And somewhere, hidden among the ranks or the ridges beyond, the hawk waited. The morning of Bosworth was heavy with mist, the kind that clings to the ground and hides the shape of things until you are nearly upon them. From where I stood among the king's attendants, I could see only the shifting outlines of men and horses as the army took its position. The air was damp and cold, and every breath carried the taste of iron. Richard rode the line before the sun had burned through the fog, his voice carrying over the clank of armor. He reminded the men that they fought for England's crown, for the stability of the realm, for the honor of their own names. I watched their faces. Some were stirred, shouting the king's name. Others nodded in silence, their eyes already fixed elsewhere, perhaps on the ridges where Lord Stanley's troops lingered apart. The ground was treacherous here, a patchwork of marsh and uneven ridges. To the left, the Duke of Norfolk commanded his division, the most steadfast of Richard's allies. To the right, Northumberland's forces waited, and I saw at once that their formation seemed too far withdrawn, a gap between them and the king's main line. In that space, disaster could seep in like water through a breach. From the mist ahead came the sound of drums, slow, deliberate, foreign in their rhythm. Tudor's army was advancing. As the haze began to thin, the dark shapes of his French pikemen emerged, long spears held upright like a moving forest. Behind them, the banners of Wales and the red dragon of Henry's standard rippled in the morning wind. The first clash came sudden and violent. Norfolk's men met the enemy's vanguard with a crash that echoed across the field. The scream of horses, the grind of steel on steel. It was as if the world had been split open. Richard signaled the advance of his own center, and we moved forward, the white boar standard high above the press of helmets. I saw courage that morning, raw and defiant. The king led from the front, his sword flashing, his warhorse plunging into the thickest fighting. Men fought like they knew this day would decide the rest of their lives. Yet even in those first moments, I felt the shadow of betrayal creeping in. Northumberland's forces still held back, their banners motionless. No order could explain such delay. The king's messengers rode to them and returned without change. Whatever words passed, Northumberland did not move. A hole in our line yawned wider with each passing moment, and Tudor's captains were not slow to see it. I was carrying dispatches between the king and Norfolk when I caught sight of movement on the far ridge. Lord Stanley's banners had shifted. His men were not advancing toward Tudor nor toward us, but were spreading along the high ground, as though positioning to fall upon whichever side the moment favored. It was then I understood the full cruelty of his game. He meant to wait until victory leaned clearly one way, and only then would the hawk strike. The fighting thickened, and the ground turned slick with blood. I saw Norfolk himself cut down by a blow from a halberd, his body falling among the press. The news reached the king quickly. His jaw set hard, and in that moment something seemed to change in him. He no longer fought as a commander preserving his line, but as a man with one single aim. Through the chaos, Richard caught sight of Henry Tudor, not far beyond the front, surrounded by his guard. With a shout, he spurred his horse forward, gathering a small band of loyal knights to him. It was not a cautious advance, it was a charge meant to end the battle in one stroke. If he could cut down Tudor, the pretender's army might break. I followed at a distance, the din of combat swelling around us. The king's charge tore through the first ranks of Tudor's men, scattering them. I saw Richard strike down Sir William Brandon, the standard-bearer of the Red Dragon, with such force that the banner fell into the mud. For a moment it seemed the impossible might be within reach. Tudor himself was in sight, reining his horse back in alarm. But fate and treachery were quicker. From the ridge, Stanley's forces began to move at last, and they moved toward Richard. The hawk had chosen its prey. I remember the shout that rose from our rear lines, a sound of horror and disbelief. The king was deep in the enemy's ranks now, cut off from support. Northumberland still did not advance. Stanley's men surged down the slope, striking at Richard's flank, sealing the trap. The mist, the shouts, the clash of steel. It was all one swirling chaos. I lost sight of the king in the press, but I could still hear him. His voice, fierce and defiant, rose above the din. Treason! 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 And then, like a door slamming shut, the sound was swallowed by the tide of battle. The world seemed to close in around me the moment the king's warhorse went down. The noise of battle, that deafening mixture of screams, steel, and shouts, changed in my ears. It was no longer the clash of two armies, but the sound of a hunt nearing its end. Every blow, every roar, every frantic cry felt aimed toward the single man who still fought at the center of the storm. I had been following at a distance when Richard's great black destrier, the one he had ridden since his coronation, gave a high-pitched scream. A French pike, driven from beneath, had pierced the horse's belly. The beast reared in agony, and the king, his armor flashing wet in the pale light, was thrown heavily into the mud. Gasps rippled even among Tudor's ranks, for all men knew that to be unhorsed in such a press was to stand on the edge of death. Yet Richard rose. Slowly, almost deliberately, he planted his feet in the churned soil, sword already raised. The white plume of his helmet hung at a broken angle, caked with blood and filth, but he looked not like a man defeated. He looked like a figure torn from some ancient saga, doomed yet unbowed. The circle of enemies around him was tightening. At the fore was Sir William Brandon, Henry Tudor's standard-bearer, holding the Red Dragon high. He surged forward, calling his men to close. Richard met him head-on, the clash ringing out like a hammer on an anvil. In one brutal stroke, the king's blade split through Brandon's guard and struck him down. The dragon banner toppled into the mire. A roar went up, not one of triumph, but of shock. I could feel the ripple of it pass through the press of men. For a moment, just a moment, it was as if Richard might actually carve his way to Tudor himself. He pressed on. A massive knight, Sir John Cheney, rode into the path, towering over Richard by head and shoulders. Cheney swung his sword in a sweeping arc meant to crush the king outright. But Richard stepped into the blow, the edge glancing from his armor, and with a ferocity that was almost inhuman, he struck upward. Cheney fell like an oak, and the path to Tudor opened further. I pushed forward through the chaos, my heart pounding in my ears. I saw Henry himself now, pulled back by his guard, his face pale beneath the crownless helm. He had not expected Richard to come so close. The king's small knot of loyal knights, fewer than a dozen, hacked and shoved their way forward, calling his name, shielding him with their bodies. Then, from the ridge to the right, movement. Stanley's banners began to descend. For hours they had waited, neither aiding us nor openly joining Tudor. Now their line poured down the slope like a dark tide, not toward the pretender, but toward our king's exposed flank. I knew what it meant before the first of Stanley's men struck. The hawk had chosen its prey. This was no mere joining of the fray. It was the closing of a trap that had been laid long before dawn. Richard's knights fought like men possessed, but the weight of numbers crashed upon them from two sides. Tudor's guard surged in front. Stanley's fresh troops slammed in from the right. Spears stabbed for the joints in the king's armor. Blades hacked at his shoulders and legs. One blow struck him across the helm, denting the crown into the metal. Still he stood. Through the shouts and clangor, I heard his voice. It rose above the noise, fierce and ragged. Treason! 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 Whether it was meant for Stanley, for Northumberland, who still sat idle with his untouched men far to the rear, or for the whole host of turncoats, I cannot say. But the cry was taken up by others near him, until it seemed the word itself had become a weapon. Richard pressed forward still, his eyes fixed on Tudor. At one point I swear there were no more than 3 men between them. But then a pike drove into the gap beneath his arm, punching through mail into flesh. He staggered. A halberd followed, smashing into his side. Another struck the back of his helm. His loyal knights fell one by one. Sir Percival Thirlwall, even after both legs were broken, still clung to his banner until he was cut down. Others tried to drag Richard back, but he tore free, swinging his sword in wide, desperate arcs. It was then he gave that final cry that would be remembered for centuries, though most would never understand its true meaning. A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse! This was no coward's plea for flight. It was the shout of a warrior demanding the speed to strike again, to finish the charge that fate and treachery had torn from him. But no horse came, for those who could have brought one had already chosen which crown they wished to see raised before nightfall. The circle tightened. The king's armor was slick with blood, his own and that of his enemies. A poleaxe crashed down, glancing from his helm, but the next blow split the metal entirely, driving him to his knees. Still he swung upward, cutting into the thigh of a man who tried to drag him down. Another halberd found the gap at his neck, another pierced his side. And then the final stroke. A French mercenary, face hidden behind a visor, brought his blade down upon the back of Richard's head. The sound was not the ring of steel on steel, but the dull, sickening crack of finality. The king fell forward into the mud, his sword slipping from his grasp. For a heartbeat, there was silence around him. Even the enemy seemed to pause at the sight. And then the shouting began, a roar of triumph from Tudor's men, a grim murmur from ours. I remember looking to Northumberland's position. His men stood still, their armor clean, their banners unstained. The sight made me feel colder than any blade could have done. Richard's body was dragged from the press, stripped of armor, his wounds exposed for all to see. The once proud face was battered, yet there was still something unbroken in its lines, as if death itself could not erase the defiance. His crown, dented and spattered with mud, lay where it had fallen, until it was lifted and placed upon Henry Tudor's head there on the blood-wet field. And thus ended the reign of the last Plantagenet king, not in the glory of battle won or lost, but in the slow, deliberate constriction of betrayal. The roar that followed the king's death was not the sound of one side victorious, but of 100 ambitions being set free. I stood among the wreckage of the field, my legs half sunken in the churned mud, my eyes fixed on the place where Richard had fallen. The body that had been a king moments before was already being treated like a prize carcass. Hands pulled at his armor, stripping it away piece by piece, exposing the pale flesh beneath, streaked with blood and bruises. Henry Tudor had not yet descended from the rise where he had watched the final moments, but his men moved with purpose. The crown, bent, dented, and smeared with mud, was lifted from the mire and brought to him. I saw the moment he took it, holding it aloft for all to see. A ragged cheer went up from his soldiers, though I could not help but notice that many of the shouts were forced, thin, as if the men themselves were still startled by how quickly fortune had turned. I turned to see Stanley, the hawk who had waited for his moment. He rode forward now, his armor unstained except for the red spatter of others' blood on his boots. He knelt to Tudor, offering the crown as though it were a holy relic. There was no shame in his eyes, only the calm satisfaction of a man who had gambled and won. Tudor took the circlet from him and, without ceremony, placed it upon his own head. The sight was bitter beyond measure, not because a rival had triumphed, but because I knew that without Stanley's treachery, Tudor's cause might have been broken entirely that day. The battlefield was still alive with small, brutal struggles. Pockets of men who had not yet heard the king was dead were being cut down by Tudor's forces. Others surrendered and were cut down anyway, their pleas drowned in the noise. I saw Norfolk's surviving men fighting in a knot around their lord's fallen standard, refusing quarter until they were overwhelmed. In another place, a group of archers, perhaps hoping to flee, were run down by mounted men, their bodies left in the mud like broken toys. It was in this chaos that I nearly met my own end. A mounted soldier in Tudor's livery charged me, sword raised, mistaking me for one of Richard's captains. I stumbled back, raising my dagger in a hopeless defense, but at the last moment he wheeled away, spitting into the dirt beside me. "The carrion will feed well today," he muttered before riding off. I realized then that to him I was already part of the spoils. When at last the fighting subsided, the field lay in a kind of stunned silence. The crows had already begun to gather, black shapes dotting the sky. The ground was slick underfoot, every step sinking into the blood-soaked soil. I moved toward the place where Richard's body lay, driven by something I cannot name. Loyalty, perhaps, or the need to see with my own eyes that the king I had served was truly gone. They had left him naked but for a scrap of linen at the waist. The wounds were terrible. The deep gash at the base of the skull where the poleaxe had struck, the punctures of pikes and swords, the slash across his jaw that had nearly severed it. His back bore several long, shallow cuts, marks of blades drawn across him after death. I had heard of such acts before, insults meant to humiliate a fallen foe. My stomach turned at the sight. Stanley passed nearby, speaking in low tones to one of Tudor's captains. I caught a fragment of their words. "It will serve us well to let them see the body. The more they see, the more they will believe." I understood then that Richard's corpse was not merely the remains of a dead king. It was to be a message, a living weapon in the hands of the victors. The order came soon after. The body would be slung across a horse and taken to Leicester, to be displayed publicly. I watched as they lifted him, his head lolling, his hair matted with gore. There was no dignity in it, no honor in the handling. The once feared King of England now hung limp and broken, like a criminal dragged to market. As they carried him away, my gaze shifted to Northumberland. He still stood with his men, his armor unstained, his banners unruffled. He had not moved once during the battle, not even when the king was surrounded. His face was unreadable, but his hands rested lightly on the pommel of his sword, as though he had never truly drawn it. I wondered if he had already made his peace with Tudor before the day began, or if his inaction had been his own calculation of survival. Either way, his betrayal was complete. The rest of us were left to walk among the dead. I saw friends and comrades lying in grotesque positions, their faces frozen mid-cry or mid-blow. The smell of blood and trampled earth was so strong it seemed to cling to my very skin. Every so often, a groan would rise from the ground, and a wounded man would be found still breathing, though few of them lived long once discovered by Tudor's soldiers. By the time the sun began to sink, the crows were bold enough to land. They hopped among the bodies, tearing at exposed flesh, their wings flapping when disturbed. The survivors, myself among them, moved like ghosts, stepping over the dead without the strength to bury them. That night, as Tudor's camp feasted and drank in celebration, I sat apart. I thought of Richard's final moments, of the raw defiance in his cry of treason. I thought, too, of the faces in the crowd when the crown changed hands, the quick smiles, the subtle nods, the knowledge that an oath broken had been rewarded. I knew then that Bosworth was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a reign built upon bargains made in shadow. The men who had betrayed one king for their gain would not hesitate to do the same to another. And if Tudor believed otherwise, he was a greater fool than I had taken him for. Somewhere in the dark beyond the camp, the crows were feeding. The road to Leicester was little more than a winding scar across the countryside, churned to filth by the march of armies. That day it bore a cargo unlike any other, the broken body of a king. Slung naked across a horse, Richard's corpse swayed with each step of the animal, his arms dangling, his head bobbing loosely. The crown that had once rested upon that head was now in Henry Tudor's possession, and the man himself rode far ahead, surrounded by his guard. I followed at a distance, walking with the stragglers who had survived the field. The air was damp, and the clouds hung low, as though the heavens themselves sought to press the scene down into the earth. Every so often, the wind would carry forward the mutters of villagers who had come to see the procession pass. Some crossed themselves in silence. Others spat into the dirt. A few, bolder than the rest, jeered. "There goes the boar, hunted at last." I wanted to silence them, but I had no sword, no place to speak from, and no desire to draw the attention of Tudor's soldiers. The horse that bore the king's body left a dark trail in the dirt, the slow drip of blood from wounds that no longer bled in life, only in gravity. His hair hung over his face, but I could still see the purple swellings and gashes. He was no longer the Richard the First had known. He was a symbol, a warning crafted in flesh. By the time we reached Leicester, word had spread ahead of us. The streets were crowded, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and humanity. Bells rang not for mourning, but for the arrival of a new ruler. Tudor entered the city to cheers and thrown flowers, while behind him, the final Plantagenet was dragged in like a defeated criminal. The contrast was obscene, and Tudor knew it. He wanted it that way. The corpse was taken to the Greyfriars Priory, not for honorable burial, but for display. They propped him up in the hall, his wounds left uncovered, so that all might gaze upon the fallen king. For 2 days they kept him there, allowing the curious to file past. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see his battered face. Old men leaned close to whisper to one another, pointing at each scar as if it proved some private theory about his rule. There was no dignity left, only the cold spectacle of defeat. I went once, though it cost me. His face was swollen beyond recognition, but I saw in it the same sharpness that had once commanded armies. His lips were drawn back slightly, not in a grimace, but in something that might have been the ghost of a sneer. Even in death, Richard looked as though he were daring his enemies to stand closer. I could not remain long. My hands trembled, and I feared the tears that pressed against my eyes. Outside, Leicester was alive with the machinery of Tudor's new reign. Stanley walked the streets with the pride of a man whose gamble had made him indispensable. His men, still fresh from the battle, patrolled openly, ensuring no one forgot whose hand had placed the crown on Henry's head. Northumberland, ever the shadow, had already begun to gather influence, moving with the quiet assurance of one who knows how to serve a king without being seen as his servant. The rumors began almost at once. Some said Richard had been struck down by a dozen men at once, others that it had taken 3 final blows to kill him. A few whispered that Tudor had ordered his body mutilated after death to prevent the legend of his prowess from outshining the new reign. Whether truth or invention, the effect was the same. Each retelling made Richard both more monstrous and more heroic, depending on the tongue that spoke it. I kept my head down but my ears open. It was clear that those who had served Richard closely were being watched. One man I knew, a squire who had carried messages between the king and Norfolk, was taken from his lodging one night and did not return. Another, a captain from the north, was offered a choice: swear fealty to Tudor or be declared a traitor. He swore, though I could see in his eyes that the word caught in his throat. When the time came to bury Richard, there was no procession, no royal rites. His body was lowered into a hastily dug grave within the priory, without coffin or shroud. The priests spoke the necessary words, but their voices were low, as though afraid to be heard giving honor to the fallen king. Earth was thrown over him quickly, and the crowd dispersed, eager to move on to the business of the living. I lingered until the last shovelful was placed, until the earth was flat and unmarked. No stone was set to remember him, no carving to tell who lay beneath. It was as if they meant to erase him entirely, to grind his name into the dust along with his bones. But I knew the truth. A man like Richard could not be buried so easily. His story would remain, whispered in taverns, muttered by soldiers, passed along in the dark by those who still remembered. That night I walked alone through Leicester, the rain beginning to fall. The crows had followed us from the field, and I could hear their calls over the rooftops. Somewhere, in some hidden chamber, Tudor and his allies were feasting, sealing the pacts that would shape the realm. But I could not join them. I could only see the image of the king, naked across the horse, and hear his cry echo in my mind. Treason! It was not merely a word for that day, it was a prophecy. In the weeks after Bosworth, England seemed to breathe in a strange, uneasy rhythm, as if the whole realm were holding its breath. Henry Tudor had taken the crown, yet his grip upon it was not yet iron. The field had been won, but the loyalty of the kingdom was still a matter of calculation, and so his first acts were not of celebration, but of control. From my place in Leicester I began to see the pattern. Men who had fought for Richard were summoned to oaths of loyalty, a phrase that sounded benign, but in truth meant submission or ruin. Some came willingly, bowing to the new king with the smoothness of those who had already bent their hearts to betrayal before the battle. Others came with stiffer spines, their faces betraying the bitterness behind their words. A few refused altogether, and these were dealt with quietly. One by one, they vanished from their estates, their names whispered as traitors, though all knew the meaning had shifted. It was no longer treason to betray a king, only to refuse the one who had gained the throne. Stanley prospered most. His estate swelled, his authority stretched further than ever before, and in every hall he entered, the air seemed to bend toward him. Men spoke of him as the kingmaker, the hawk whose strike had won the day. Yet there were those who muttered that a hawk will kill for any master if the price is right, and that one who could betray Richard might one day betray Henry. But these mutterings never passed beyond closed doors, for Stanley's eyes seemed to be everywhere. Northumberland kept quieter still, which made him more dangerous in my mind. He moved like a shadow behind the new king, whispering counsel in tones too soft to be overheard. Those who had expected him to fall out of favor for his passivity at Bosworth were soon disabused. Henry rewarded him with influence, perhaps because he understood the value of a man who could sit still while a king died. I found myself torn between caution and curiosity. My loyalty to Richard was a private fire now, one that could not be shown. But I could not help but seek out the truth of what had passed before and during the battle. Pieces of it came to me in fragments. A page who had carried letters between Stanley and Tudor in the weeks before Bosworth. A groom who swore that Northumberland had ordered his men to stay mounted, untouched by the mud of the field. A soldier who claimed to have seen Stanley's banner dip in signal before his charge against Richard. Each fragment fit too neatly into the whole to be coincidence. And yet, these were dangerous truths. I learned quickly that men who spoke of Bosworth too freely did not last long. Some were found dead in alleys, others drowned in rivers, still others simply disappeared, leaving behind an empty bed and unanswered questions. The silence that followed each loss was louder than any accusation. Henry's court grew more lavish with each passing week, but beneath the gold and feasting was a current of unease. The king's new advisers, many of them former enemies of Richard, watched one another with the wariness of wolves forced to share a den. Every toast was measured, every laugh calculated. I had the sense that no one truly trusted anyone else, and that the crown rested not upon Henry's brow, but upon a web of bargains that could unravel with a single careless word. It was in this atmosphere that the official story of Bosworth was crafted. Tudor's men told it in markets and taverns, repeating it until it seemed it had always been true. Richard had been a tyrant unloved by his people. His army had broken at the sight of Henry's righteous advance. His death had been the will of God, cleansing England of a usurper. The tale was simple, clean, and easily swallowed. The truth, of pacts made in shadow, of men who stood idle while their king fought alone, of the hawk who turned its talons inward, was buried as deeply as Richard's unmarked grave. But buried things have a way of pushing back toward the light. I began to hear whispers in the north, where Richard had been most loved. Farmers who had lost sons at Bosworth cursed Stanley's name over their ale. Priests spoke of the sin of betrayal more than the sin of rebellion. And in the eyes of some soldiers, I saw the same haunted look I carried, the memory of the king's last cry, treason, echoing against the clangor of battle. I began to keep a record, not openly, not on parchment that could be seized, but in the hidden compartments of my mind. Each name, each meeting, each unexplained hesitation on that field. I kept them all. It was a dangerous habit, perhaps a fatal one, but I could not help myself. For if history was to be rewritten in lies, then someone had to remember the truth. Winter came early that year, and with it a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. The first snows covered the roads to Leicester, hiding the tracks of the armies that had marched to Bosworth. The earth where Richard had fallen lay quiet beneath frost, as though the field itself wished to forget what had been done upon it. But memory is not so easily buried. I carried mine with me like a second shadow. Each night I would lie awake, hearing again the cries of that day, the clash of steel, the dying shouts, and above it all, the raw, cutting cry of treason. It followed me through the narrow streets, into the markets, even into the silence of churches. I began to see it in other men's eyes, too, those who had been there, who had watched and done nothing, or fought and failed, or betrayed and lived. Henry Tudor's reign had settled into a rhythm of ceremony and control. His court glittered with feasts, his proclamations carried the weight of kingship, but beneath it all was a tension like the hush before a storm. The new king knew his crown sat upon a foundation of shifting loyalties. Every day he rewarded those whose treachery had bought his victory, and every night he feared that the same treachery might one day turn on him. I saw it in him most clearly during a banquet in London, where he sat between Stanley and Northumberland. The three of them smiled, raised cups, and exchanged polished words for all to hear. Yet the glances between them told another tale. In those glances was the memory of Bosworth, of who had moved when, who had waited, and who had struck the final blow. It was a reminder that each of them held the power to unmake the other. For myself, I kept to the edges of the court, neither too silent to draw suspicion nor too talkative to invite questions. I had learned by then that survival meant not only holding one's tongue, but knowing when to let others believe you had forgotten entirely. And yet I had not forgotten. From time to time, I would hear of another death, a knight who had spoken unwisely of the battle in a tavern, a clerk who had hinted that he knew the truth of Stanley's movements that day, a priest who had dared to question the morality of the crown's rise. These men did not die in open punishment. They vanished, their names struck from records, their families warned into silence. It was not justice. It was housekeeping. And so the truth lived only in fragments, passed in whispers between those who trusted one another's discretion. We spoke of how Northumberland had held his men back until the outcome was certain, of how Stanley had waited like a vulture for the right moment to descend, of how Richard, unhorsed and surrounded, had fought until his body could fight no more, and of how the crown had been lifted not from a battlefield won by courage, but from a murder carried out in daylight. One night, as snow fell outside my lodging, I sat alone with a cup of wine and asked myself the question that had haunted me since that day. Why had I survived? I was no great knight, no lord whose treachery might be useful, no soldier whose absence would be noticed. I was simply a witness, one who had seen too much. Perhaps the answer lay there. In the eyes of the new king and his allies, I was too small to matter. Or perhaps they thought fear had made me harmless. They were wrong. I do not write these words to bring down Henry Tudor, though God knows there is justice yet unpaid. I write them because the story of Bosworth has been bent and polished until it shines with false light, and I will not let the truth die with me. I have carried it too long, through too many winters, to see it vanish into the silence that Stanley and his like have worked so hard to keep. Let the world believe what it will, that Richard was a usurper, that Tudor's victory was righteous, that God himself favored the Red Dragon. But I was there. I saw the hawk turn its talons inward. I saw the white boar fight to his last breath, abandoned by those who had sworn to stand beside him. I saw the crown fall into the mud, and I saw the hands that lifted it were already stained with the blood of the man who had worn it. History will not remember me. But if these words survive, then perhaps some future soul will know that Bosworth was not a battle. It was a killing ground prepared by friends who called themselves loyal until the moment their profit lay elsewhere. And perhaps, if God allows, the day will come when the weight of the unspoken will finally be lifted, and the dead king will have his answer. Until then, the truth remains here, in the keeping of one who will not forget.